that's so much for the commercial part of it. And now let's just get into a little bit of bee biology. I think it's important to understand the bee. Just my thought, and the books say the same. Understand the bee before you start taking care of them, just as you would with cattle or other forms of livestock. So often I have people say, I'd like to keep bees, I'd like to get a hive. Where can I get a hive? I would say, get a book and read it first, or learn about the bees first before you get the hive. And then you'll begin to understand why the hive is constructed the way it is for the bee. But understand the bee first, and if you can focus on that and its biology, then it'll be easier for you to manage them and appreciate them and take good care of them. So a USDA study, and that's a little old too, in 2014, looked at thousands of beehives across the country and found that in July, the average beehive had about 60,000 bees in it. So some have a lot more, some have less. But that's the average that was found. And in order to make 1 pound of honey, just 16 ounces of honey, bees visit about 2 million blooms and fly about 50,000 miles. So 1 pint of honey takes an awful lot of activity, and that's one reason why there are so many bees in there. Nature has provided a lot of bees to be able to build up the amount of honey that bees need to make it through the winter. Honey is simply bee food, and we simply rob it away from them, steal it away from them, and they tend to hoard, of course, so as long as you give them space, if there's a nectar flow, they'll just keep making honey for you. And so when I was growing up in Minnesota, it was fairly often that we would collect 250 extra pounds of honey off of a hive that we could take away from the bees, and we left 150 for them. That's a lot of honey. The further north you go, the more honey bees will make. So they're genetically disposed to make more because they know the winters, they don't know, but the winters are longer and colder, and it's going to take more honey for them. So the average hive in Kansas, and that was 2012, but we have the numbers for last year also. It was about 65 pounds, and it stays about that year after year. We have to report our hives to USDA, and we get feedback from USDA on the whole country. And it was down to 45 pounds a couple of years ago, and it's been as high as 70 pounds, but it averages out at about 65, I think, over the last 7 or 8 years. And that's the honey we can take away. And so here you should leave at least 60 to 80 pounds of honey in the brood chambers for the bees to make it through a winter. That's a rule of thumb, at least. And of course, in the process of building up that honey and pollen stocks in the hive, they pollinate millions of plants in process. And it's really fascinating to watch as you keep bees to see how they communicate. Some say that really if you took an average size hive of bees, I read in one of the American Bee Journals, and impressed it's about the same size as a human brain. I think that's a real stretch, but they say it's a superorganism. That whole colony of bees is a superorganism. And to a degree, perhaps that's the way it is, because one bee can't exist on its own, or 2 or 3 can't. But together, they form a community that exists and is very, very resilient, given the fragility of those little honeybees. So to watch how they function together is just amazing as you work with them. And of course, they're just like the canary in the coal mine. They're telling us something about how we're taking care of our environment. With all the pesticides and herbicides and fungicides and the lack of forage, they're telling us that things are happening that probably aren't so good. So we should, just like the canary in the coal mine, we should watch them because they're sending us a strong message. And it's harder and harder to keep bees alive. But when I was a young man in Minnesota, seldom did we lose a hive. And in the springtime, when the Tri-County Club would get together, the issue was, what are we going to do with all these bees that have grown so strong? We have to split our hives, and nobody wanted to grow, so they would argue over the fact that they had too many bees and you just got to take more. It's not that way today. Today, keeping bees alive is much harder. It takes a lot more work. And now, if you offered free bees at a bee club meeting, you'd have all kinds of hands raised to say, I'll take them, I'll take them. So, Okay, so central to the hive is the single queen. Every hive has one single queen, and she's a little bigger, longer, fatter than the other bees. Um, and her function is to keep that colony alive. She is the future of that hive, and her function is to lay eggs, and lots of them. At peak, around 2,000 eggs. One article may say 1,500, another will say 3,000. But about 2,000 eggs a day, and that will really start peaking here before long in April to build up from the 20 or 30,000 bees that are in there now up to 60,000 or 50,000. Takes a lot of eggs, given the fact that bees don't live that long. And so her function is to lay eggs constantly. And if you haven't kept bees before, you'll be able to watch your queen lay eggs when you reach the point where you can find her, and it's amazing to watch them. So all the bees are completely loyal to her. She gives out a queen mandibular pheromone, QMP, from her mandibles, and it's unique to each bee. If you were to concentrate that pheromone, it smells much like lemongrass oil, and each queen though gives off just a little different scent than another queen, so the bees can attach to her, and her pheromone is key. There's another pheromone in the hive called brood pheromone that's given off by the larva. And the brood is eggs, larvae, and pupa in a hive. There's a pheromone given off, and when the pheromone from that brood and the queen's pheromone are matched, or equal, you have a situation in the hive that's very healthy. And the bees can detect that. They know it's healthy when the balance is correct. And they have the ability to offset problems with that. If there's a lack of brood pheromone, or if there's a lack of queen pheromone, they can make a change in the hive to try to correct it. They can build a new queen if they don't like that one. We'll talk more about that later. And if there's not enough brood, that's usually because maybe there's not enough space, or the queen is not laying well enough, and they'll offset that too. So by swarming or by creating a new queen. A lot of the commercial beekeepers replace their queens annually. Many of them do so in September. If you replace a queen in September in a hive, it reduces the tendency, probably will not swarm the following spring. And you're probably going to get, if it's a good queen, a more viable winter brood from a new queen. Not always. It's hard for me to go in there and see this really robust hive with lots of brood in there and lots of bees, and then go in and kill the queen to put a new one in. So I'm probably a little bit soft-hearted at my old age. I just don't like to kill those queens if they look to be healthy. But the fact is that in the commercial business, they do that to increase the robustness of the hive, and it's just a standard. And if the bees find that she's not doing well enough, not laying eggs, and she's getting old, they'll replace her. So she can live 4 to 5 years, but most of them don't live beyond 2.5 years or 3 years, because they'll begin to reduce their egg laying capability, and as they get older, and the bees will then replace her. Worker bees make up 99.99999% of the bees in the hive. They're all female workers, and so the queen is produced by feeding a cell that usually find a 1-day-old larva. So just as an egg splits on the 4th day, it's an egg 3 days after she lays them. On the 4th day, it becomes a larva. So this little rice-like thing in the bottom of the cup curls just a little bit, and it's on a bed of royal jelly produced in the glands of the worker bees. And then the bees decide they're going to make that 1-day-old larva a queen, and then they feed it nothing but royal jelly for the next 6 days until it's capped. And then they cap it, and the queen pupates in there, feeds on the royal jelly, and on the 16th day, she will hatch out as a queen. So it's different with worker bees. So they only live about 5 weeks in the summertime because they fly themselves to death out there in the work that they do. They arrive 21 days after an egg is laid, so it takes them longer. They're not fed, they're fed just a little royal jelly to begin with, but they're fed bee bread, a combination of pollen and nectar as they grow in there. And so, although they're females, they usually don't lay eggs. They can, but they arrive 21 days after the egg is laid. And so as you get into beekeeping, if you're new, you'll be able to count the days from the time you see your first eggs in there until the bees start hatching. So it's the same though. They're 3 days an egg, 6 days a larva, and then in this case 12 days as a pupa. And out comes a female worker, and they begin working immediately. And you'll see them chew their way out of those cells. They're a little lighter, they have the bee's skeleton is tightened just like on a shrimp or a crab. And it takes about 2 days for that chitin to harden, so they can't fly initially until its wings get hard. But they're a little lighter, and they immediately start cleaning out their own cell, the webbing in there. They do the best they can. I'll take a break in a minute here. Let me finish the worker bees first, and they go through 16 or 17 different jobs, maybe 14 different articles count the different ones. But they guard and they feed larvae, they feed drones, and they take care of the queen, and they receive nectar. The house bees receive nectar from bees coming in, and pollen from bees coming in, put it in the cells, and so they have all those different jobs. At 3 weeks, they become a forager, and out they go to collect pollen, nectar, water, and sap from some trees, turn into something called propolis. The nectar that they bring in is what becomes our honey. It's usually 60 to 70% water when it comes in. Good honey is 16% or so water. And so they have to continue to put that nectar into the cells, and they fan off and evaporate the water out of it until it's 16% or so, 17%, and then they cap it. So it's like putting a jar on top of a cap, and that honey becomes good for a long while, at least 3,000 years that we know for sure. So about a 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey is what's made by a bee in its lifetime. And they fly as far as 3 miles out to find those pollen, nectar, and water and sap sources, and they fly themselves to death in that conquest. So you can see the older bees in there with tattered wings. They're nearing the end of their life. The winter bees, the bees born in the late fall, are different. So they can live 3 to 4 months. So their job is to take on lipids or fats and to heat the hive during the winter. So these hives that you see out there now have clusters of bees in them, and most of the bees in there are winter bees that are being carried over from last fall, and their job is bees don't have wing muscles. They have muscles that attach to their diaphragm, and they shake their diaphragm to make their wings fly, actually. And so they shake sort of like we do, and they create heat inside that hive to keep it viable during the entire winter. So they consume honey, heat the hive, and then pretty soon the hive will start producing this next crop of forager bees. Won't be long. The queens start laying as early as January here. So she has to be kept 95, 94 degrees, 96 degrees in there to be viable. So it's amazing that they can function and they occur all the way up to the Arctic Circle. So they can survive even in those deep below zero temperatures. Okay, let's take a break and do a drawing.